It's my great pleasure today to be here to have a conversation with my friend Frank Schaeffer. Frank is an author, film director, screenwriter, and public speaker. He's the son of the late theologian and author Francis Schaeffer, and he became a Hollywood film director and author, writing several internationally acclaimed novels depicting life in a strict evangelical household. As someone who came from a background very similar to Frank's, I really want you to buy the book that we're going to talk about today and give it to your friends. It is Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. This book is a perfect stocking stuffer for the holidays, or a Kindle stuffer if your loved ones like to read books online. So I want to first of all thank you, Frank, for consenting to do this conversation today regarding your new book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be talking with you and to be doing a podcast with someone who I admire so much. And, as you know, I wrote the foreword to a book of yours.
Yes.
So we are friends. Thanks for having me on, Carolyn.
You're absolutely welcome. In your new book, you say, quote, "The religious documentary series I directed featured my famous evangelical evangelist father, Francis Schaeffer. The movies were destructive. In my early to mid-20s, I collaborated with my father and produced and directed 2 documentary movie series, How Should We Then Live? And Whatever Happened to the Human Race. Taken together, these series and their book companions provided the toxic ideological incentive for millions of Christians in the evangelical subculture to turn into a xenophobic, aggrieved, and perpetually angry mob. In other words, we set out to make them into people as immoral as us. That is to say, our series pushed evangelicals into the anti-choice, misogyny-enforcing cult known as the pro-life movement. 40 years later, this cult helped elect Donald Trump." So is it okay, Frank, if I give a little bit of background before we actually get into talking about the book?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're reading there from the foreword where I'm trying to set up things a little bit and explain my own journey to folks. So please do jump right in.
Okay, sure. You write that the evangelical movement has become a fraudulent empire, white supremacist movement, personality cult replacing a political party. And I recently heard you compare our current situation in the US to the early stages of the Weimar Republic in that we're facing what the Germans faced at that time, say 1937, 1938. We're on the cusp. The big lie of a stolen 2020 election is being made a permanent feature of Republican politics. In other words, they're going to reject the results of any election they don't like. They'll also undermine voting to the extent that no one really trusts voting, and they'll make voting so difficult that no one actually wants to vote. And, while storming the Capitol on January 6th, while that was horrific, this is a form of insurrection that is more horrific. And you say that unless the Democrats defeat this white nationalist, racist, misogynist, uber capitalist movement, this will be the rest of American history for the rest of our lives. The very existence of our democracy is online. And you also talk about the Reconstructionist movement, one example being the New Apostolic Reformation, which is the notion that Christians are here to establish a theocracy. Their job is to influence all aspects of society, culture, education, politics, medicine, all institutions, so that they will become theocratic institutions that carry out the reconstruction, what the Reconstructionists perceive as God's will. They don't believe in democracy, they believe in theocracy. So what is obvious to me is that this is a real Handmaid's Tale. And it's really important to understand that what the evangelicals are up to is not a culture war, but a movement to bring America back to God as they interpret God and a society run by God. And you also make another very important point. These evangelical theocrats are not being used by the Republican Party. In fact, these theocrats are using the Republican Party to achieve what they want to achieve. So with that in mind, let's now talk about the book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. You say that this is a very progressive book, and I agree. So talk a little bit about why this is a progressive book.
Yeah, well, the book makes a very simple case. And I guess I should talk about the fact first, there are kind of three threads in the book that I've woven together to make this case, and then I'll get back to what the case is. The three threads are that for the last 12 years, I have been doing full-time childcare for my three youngest grandchildren. I started keeping a diary about, 8, 9 years ago about what I was doing with my little granddaughter, Lucy, who's now 13. And eventually, being a writer who folds my life into my work, I thought, okay, there might be a book here. And I started sending the first couple drafts of a manuscript using this diary to friends of mine who happen to teach at university level when it comes to science, one in particular, Myrna Perez Sheldon. And they reacted very positively to it, but they said, look, there's a much bigger story here, because you may or may not realize it, but that's what you're writing about here is right on the cusp of neurobiology, evolutionary psychology, and where it's all gone. And the way they put it to me, Myrna explained it to me, was this. She said, look, up until about 25 years ago, the idea that had currency was that it was always about the survival of the fittest. And she said, but all the more recent science is showing that it was really something entirely different. And that is, it's the survival of the friendliest. The reason any of us are here is because the human race is cooperative and it's nurturing. Now, there are huge exceptions to that: wars, Holocaust, rape, pillage. But the fact is, Carolyn, you and I wouldn't even be having this conversation unless the majority of humans through history had opted for caregiving.
Yes.
You know, the way I imagine it, you've got this background of trees there in the background. So let's picture a trail through the forest. And 10,000 years ago, in a hunter-gatherer period of your ancestry, your great somebody or other is left by a trail or the survival of a battle. You're only here because somebody picked that child up, and they didn't throw it away, and they didn't eat her for dinner. They nurtured her, they cared for her. There was a human instinct of nurture and care. So the first thread of my book is trying to understand why it is I gain such pleasure from being a nurturer caregiver rather than a striver. And my sciencey friends said, look, if you'll do some reading, and they started referring me to various books and papers and essays and projects, you'll find out that there's a lot of support for what you're talking about as a male caregiver, someone who has stepped out of this traditional American role of it's all about business and money, but you're taking care of these grandchildren. So that was the first thread. The second thread then began when I started this study project about 5 years ago, reading the books that Myrna and some of her colleagues who teach science and other people began to reference for me. It happened that most of the experts that I was referring to and asking about this and who I was reading turned out to be women who were on the very cusp of this scientific endeavor of study. So I began to fill in the blanks, and it was no longer just a diary about loving and caring for these grandchildren. I began to back it up with trying to explore my own feelings, this intense passion of love for these kids, but also just the fact that here I am pushing 70. Why would these be such happy days for me? The whole myth of the 1960s was that, getting old was something scary. And here I was finding out that actually this part of my life was the most complete. So go figure. So that was sort of the second thread. Then the third thread, of course, is the COVID pandemic. And when that hit, I sheltered in place with these three kids. They weren't in school. And what had been part-time became kind of full-time. Mm-hmm. And so then, of course, I had to rewrite the book in the last couple of drafts because a very strange thing had happened. And I don't want to make light of the pandemic. I had two very dear friends who died in it. I'm not in any way making light. But having said that, it's as if I had spent 4.5, 5 years researching a project saying, wouldn't it be interesting if we tried this? And all of a sudden, Mother Nature sends a memo and says, you know what, the whole nation is about to have to try it. And I'm not being facetious. And of course, it really didn't happen that way. But it is as if a giant social political phenomena experiment suddenly landed in our laps on all sorts of fronts. No jet trails in the sky. Cars are parked. The roads are empty. there are foxes and coyotes wandering around urban landscapes.
Right.
Human beings have gone home to be with each other, have been thrown back totally on the quality of their relationships or none, and then they're very lonely and depressed. And suddenly this experiment becomes real. So the last, I guess, thread that runs through the book is essentially taking account of the fact of what happens when, for instance, a huge male population that's done very little childcare now is at home having to care for toddlers that they thought was women's work. Do the men all hate it and walk? No, according to the articles and the studies that were done about 2/3 of the way through the lockdown, most of them say, I'm going to try to reorganize my life. Well, actually 40% said, I'm going to try to organize my life in a way that allows me to keep doing this. People were discovering things that I'm talking about in the book in terms of caregiving and priority. So having woven those three threads together, let me get to the conclusion here, or the beginning of the question, what is this book about? It's only about one thing. All these threads weave together to ask one question, and that is, isn't it time to redefine what we mean by the word success? Personal success, societal success, economic success, national success. Our idea of success, your personal idea, Carolyn, or mine, or our national idea of success will define exactly who we are, because that defines what we're pushing for, what we prioritize. So I'll just give you an example. If our idea of success is all about GDP, it's all about wealth, it's all about power, position, and the definition of ourselves by our career or our educational attainment, we're going to be one kind of person. If, on the other hand, our idea of success is to see in the eyes of those we love and care for and or receive care from, because this is a two-way street, kindness, compassion, happiness, joy, wonder, then that is a different kind of measure of success. It's not one where you build your own rocket and fly into outer space. It's basically, how are you treating the people who work for you? What is your relationship with those closest to you? What would your girlfriend, boyfriend, lover, partner say about you? That's a completely different measure. So essentially what the book is arguing for is that in North America, we have misplaced our idea of success so badly in a kind of an Ayn Randian triumphant march of the powerful male over females, the powerful leader, the great visionary over everybody else, the billionaire class, etc., to a point where the result has been very, very unhappy. So, for instance, all the statistics that are being done by insurance companies because they want to understand their actuarial tables and suicide numbers and so forth on loneliness have been skyrocketing. Anywhere you measure it, this culture is not working very well when it comes to trying to measure joy, happiness, wonder, these things that give life its essence. And the reason is very simple, and that is we define ourselves by our job title, by our career. And so it all comes to that. We tell kids, do big fancy things, make sure you don't fall in love too young, don't commit to anything or anybody, get that master's degree first. Oh, you're in a PhD program, but you want to have a child, wait till you're done with the program. It'll be frowned upon to step out. And of course, this has been particularly hard on females in the sense that they have a biological clock, and if they do want a family, or if a male wants to be a caregiver and there's no paternity care, touch it wherever you want. This culture is basically anti-female, profoundly so. It is anti-family, it is anti-child, and it is literally, quite literally, pro-death. And some of the most ardent pro-death advocates are so-called pro-lifers that tell women, you have a choice. Have an abortion, and you are a murderess, and we're going to prosecute you to the inch of the law or sue you in Texas or whatever, or keep the child and go broke. We're going to give you no choices. We're not going to tell you anything about what we would do about minimum wage for working single parents. We're not going to do anything in terms of childcare. We will do nothing about an educational system. We're not even going to have aftercare in your local public school for a child when you're stuck at that 9 to 5 or 9 to midnight job at McDonald's, whatever it is. We'll do nothing for you. So I guess the premise of the book is this: not for moralistic reasons or because Jesus said so or anything else, but if you actually want to find joy, you've got to start with examining yourself on how you define success. because that in turn will define your goals. And this, I will wax biblical, having come from a Christian background. This, if you want to take the Christian spin for the few Christians left out there who are trying to follow Jesus rather than Donald Trump, the Christian spin would be this. It's very much that verse in the scripture that says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Well, I'm saying where your definition of success is will define who you are and how you treat people. That's the thesis of the book. So Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet turned into a basically 6-year project. The last year, essentially rewriting the book several times in the light of this weird thing of the COVID phenomena that just jumps up and it's just crazy. You write about people staying home and rediscovering what's important to them, and all of a sudden everybody's doing it. Right. It's as if I threw a switch and the experiment's now gone live. This is no longer, the old thing from the action movies. This is not a rehearsal. This is not a drill.
Right.
It was like that. So what I was writing as a kind of a rehearsal and drill suddenly went live, and a whole country, in fact, the whole world was trying to figure out what to do. And one last thing I want to say in terms of it being a progressive book. When I say fall in love, have children, stay put, save the planet, be happy, I don't mean fall in love romantically is all I'm talking about. I'm talking about falling in love with the idea that relationships are more important and define you. Have children. My son is 50-year-old. He's a teacher. He is single. He has no biological children. And yet parents talk to me about the way he has parented their sons and daughters with extra math and physics tutoring on weekends, when he cooks them sumptuous meals first, then teaches them, because he is a parent. And so this idea that caregiving has to do with having children or being married is nonsense. Yeah. One last thing, when it gets to that, one of the studies I cite in the book is how gay adoptive parents, male and female, or straight or any other adoptive parent, all the science in the last 25 years, actually some incredible studies I cite in detail, have found that even parenthood is not necessarily biological, let alone gendered, because they have found that, for instance, gay male adoptive parents who bond with their child and give a lot of time to that bonding have exactly the same hormonal levels in the brain of oxytocin, and also measurable hormones in other parts of their system from saliva tests, blood tests. The scans come out the same as mothers breastfeeding a newborn child. And the weird thing is they discovered that only because they were trying to do a control on a study of women. And they said, okay, well, let's test some men to find what they thought was going to be an unimaginable difference in reaction. And they found that even adoptive parents have this same nurturing instinct if they will allow it to take hold. So the whole idea that somehow males are not nurturers, that this is a female task, that motherhood is about biology and not about choice, that's a really interesting thing, is nonsense. And so this idea that the survival of the friendliest is what drives us is the case my book makes, but it doesn't make it in the abstract. Fortunately, the science is there. And so one last thing, this coincidence of the COVID epidemic happening just as I finished my book, and the fact that only in this last 25-year period could you even write this book, because the science had not developed, right, and the technology had not developed. So pre-brain scan, pre-hormonal, certain hormonal tests in the bloodstream and saliva, this book would just be conjecture. But now two things happened: a COVID pandemic worldwide, to actually test my thesis on, for instance, male caregivers who were, quote, stuck at home. And then on the other hand, the science, which is so up to date now in terms of the phenomena that takes place in the human brain and its malleability, which is basically a new field, relatively speaking, it's kind of nuts. I didn't see my diary I was keeping about my little grandchildren at all as the crossroads of a huge cultural, political, scientific shift, but actually it turns out really was. Right. And so it's an unusual book for me because I'm not a sciencey person, but I guess 6 years of study is enough to make you a fairly informed lay person, at least in one little area.
Exactly. Well, the next question I want to ask you might sound a little bit like I'm playing devil's advocate, and I suppose to some extent I am. You know, I'm one of many authors who for the last 15 years or so have been writing about the trajectory that climate change is taking and the resulting collapse of systems that will ensue in the wake of climate chaos.
Yeah.
So what we've been saying for the most part is that having children staying put and being happy are fever dreams of the white entitled masses, and that what we need to be doing is not having children. That's the most ethical thing to do, that most of us aren't likely to stay put because climate chaos is going to uproot us,
Yeah.
not once, but many times, and that being happy is not something we're likely to experience in such a dire scenario. Now, I know you understand this perspective, and I
Sure.
also know that you see it differently. So please elaborate on this.
I see it differently, but not in the sense that contradicts what you're saying. Let me give you a weird answer first. It seems to shoot off to left field, but I promise you I will come back to the real question.
Okay.
I wrote a book called Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God.
Right.
Why did I title it that? Because I believe in paradox. I believe in uncertainty. I am a rebel against fundamentalist certainties on all fronts. And so when I get to the question of have no children and save the planet because the population is a threat, there's no way that's not true. Of course it's true. But what is also true is that as you look at the future of the planet, when it comes to human, should we say, input, whether it's carbon footprint or anything else, you're going to have people that care about the communities they're in. And speaking from my own experience, for years I drove past the local public school because my kids wound up going to a private high school. This is 25 some years ago here. When we moved to the area, there wasn't a very good option. Now it's much better here in this little northern Massachusetts town I live in. And my grandchildren go to public school locally. And I can say that my own level of involvement in my local community changed exponentially as I began to pick them up from that school in person, got to know the younger parents who were there because I'm a grandparent, and really became involved. Now, that's not a complete answer to what I'm saying, but if you tell me Frank Schaeffer saved the planet, it's going to be, hey, I'm pushing 70. Yes, the water's rising. I've had a decent enough life. I got away with it and I'll be gone. If you tell me to do it for good deed's sake, because we should love nature, it's like, that's a better argument. The intrinsic worth of the beauty around me, that speaks to me, but it doesn't get me to do much. When you tell me that Nora is threatened, and this little girl that I just spent literally 10 minutes ago reading the last chapter of Alice in Wonderland to, that her life is going to be ruined unless I get off my butt and start doing something locally, as well as politically and nationally. Now you sort of got my attention if I believe you. So what I'm trying to say is you have a paradox here. And that is, yes, population is a problem, but let me give you a kind of a visual image which illustrates what I'm saying. I picture a beach Nora and I go to, and sometimes there's a young parent there, a mom or a father or an adoptive parent or somebody else. So just picture a younger mother sitting there breastfeeding a child. And meanwhile, out in the water, 6 jet skis are going by, shattering the silence and tearing up the environment and running over the backs of whatever's trying to swim out there in the aquatic nature. The threat on that beach is not the fact she had a child. It's the priorities of trying to be cool and have a great time at the expense of the planet of those 6 guys roaring by on jet skis. I don't see a contradiction in saying that having a child and loving a child, or starting a family or not starting a family, but being a parent like my son is to many kids in other ways, I don't think that contradicts a sensitivity to population and the planet. So my book is not saying the only way to be happy is to have 6 kids or even 3 kids or 1 kid. My book is saying, unless we start parenting each other the way you, Carolyn Baker, are parenting me today, as if you are my mother, because you are giving your son that you've just adopted a chance to talk about what he spent 6 years of his life on, just like I have talked to you on my podcast because I honor and respect you. That's parenting too. Yes, so yes. I don't think the choice is between treating Carolyn Baker with respect as a human being and parenting her because she's on my podcast as somehow a statement that I am so glad that you were born and have consumed whatever you consumed during your life. I think you have to work both together. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is there is no appeal in telling people that mass suicide is the only option. Right. And so we have to deal realistically with where we are. And where we are is a bunch of very selfish people sometimes who are only motivated by certain types of connection. And love is the big one. and nature gave us this power. I guess if I differ with you, it's that my view is perhaps in an overarching sense, less bleak, not of the environmental catastrophe we're facing, but it's less bleak again in a paradoxically bleak way. I happen to, one of my favorite periods of history is what came out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. None of that path would have started without the Black Death consuming up to a third of the European population. And it was the rethink on that and the mythology the church had been preaching that encouraged people like the Medicis, for all their faults, to back Galileo and other scientists and say, look, there's got to be a better way of looking at things than waiting for miracles. Mm-hmm. And so I think that same energy can come out of the twin catastrophe of pandemic, ongoing pandemic that's not going to end easily, the kind of the deconstruction of the American empire, which we're in the middle of, and all these things. I don't necessarily see it spelling disaster on a long-term path for the human race. Neither am I a crazy optimist, but I think the fact that we evolved as caregivers signals that if anything is going to bring human creativity to the fore to actually tackle this, it's going to be not pure selfishness, but selfishness in a more altruistic sense of selfish because you love people around you. And so to build those bonds, I don't think is contradicted by the fact that population is a problem when that population is hooked to a neoliberal selfishness that has consumed the planet and has been going a long time. The problem there to me is not somebody having a child. The problem is somebody having a child and saying the purpose of your life is to go to Harvard Business School and make $1 zillion, right? Because that's what's consuming the planet. Yeah, that's the problem. So I don't think there's a simple solution, but I also don't think that, for me personally, I don't find myself in despair. What I find myself in is feeling really trepidatious and nervous about the future, but also believing that the only hope we have is to call out those things within us which are part of the caregiving tradition and not the rapacious neoliberal capitalist model. That's what has to be rethought. And I think there's a chance, I didn't say I think it will be, but there's a chance when you look at what some younger people are asking for now that it is being rethought. All I'm telling those younger people is, on your way through, make sure that your life doesn't stop, no matter how good the cause you're involved in, because then you will have no real motivation for continuing in this struggle. It's far, far, far more likely the struggle will continue with people who have a vested interest in the community around them and in the life of the people around them. That's, I haven't made a watertight case here at all, but that's my best shot at answering it. And again, it comes back to a paradoxical view of things, spirituality and the rest of it, that says, hey, listen, I'm an atheist who believes in God. You got a problem with that? I mean, let's talk about it. But that's the best I can put it. I am an optimist who believes in catastrophe. I am a father who believes in population control. Yeah. I am a grandparent who believes in joy through human connection, all the while knowing that we humans are parasitical on our environment, and it is a sort of a slow motion suicide. I think all these things coexist, and this is the paradox of the human condition. We are conscious of our own failings as well as other things.
Well, I'm totally with you. I am totally with you on all of what you said. And, at one point in the book, you mentioned this earlier, and I'd like to get back to it, but in the book you say, a no-child version of caregiving, say a vocation like teaching or animal rescue or scientific research, running for office, serving in the government, making art, or doing service to others in other ways, is an equally generous, loving form of engagement, also offering a community and care-based life of joy. Yes. And it seems to me that, for instance, a ballet dancer who chooses not to have children because her body is well-honed, perpetually trained instrument, is not missing out, but simply finding other good ways to declare the intrinsic worth of beauty, life, and love, unquote. Yes. Now, I love that because, like you spoke about your son, I've never had children or wanted to, and yet a huge part of my life has been about nurturing and caregiving.
Yes.
And that
Yeah.
is also the most meaningful part of my life. Just
Yeah.
very recently, I think a couple of days ago, right-wing Senator Tom Cotton accused the out lesbian president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, of being unqualified to teach because she has no children. And yet Randy has been a superb educator and spent her life caring for children, even though she doesn't have any of her own. And she, her rebuttal to Cotton was, oh, are you putting down all of the nuns who have
Yeah.
taught children for hundreds of years? So I'm just, I'm really taken with your whole wide spectrum definition of parenting and how we are all parents, whether we realize it or not. We are all parents, and you are actually pleading with us to be caregivers, to care for each other, to care for the earth and our little patch of it, to care for animals, for children, to care for the homeless, to care for the disabled, and on and on and on. And in a world that's ravaged by climate chaos and rotting infrastructure and the collapse of human systems, we're going to desperately need to care for each other. It's not just about surviving, it's about caring.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you dig through the book, as you know, because you're reading, these are not token throwaway lines. Some of my best friends are fill in the blank.
Right.
And now we'll get back to what I'm trying to say. I really mean this. And I do it in the storytelling parts of the book too, where, for instance, you encounter my friends Jane and Betty, who were living at L'Abri as a lesbian couple, and were there through my whole childhood and were together. And of course, being an evangelical work, they were, openly out in the closet at the same time, as in my parents loved them. And Dad, fortunately, God bless him, and my mother, were a lot of things, but they were not bigots when it came to how they ran their ministry. In fact, one of the reasons I left the evangelical community like a cat that had boiling water, scalding water thrown on it, was when I got to know these other right-wing evangelical leaders and compared it to the openness of the community I was raised in, which had many faults, and the theology, crazy stuff and so forth. But back in the early day when it was an open community, there was none of that kind of horrible prejudice. And the fact that we were then selling it as part of a so-called pro-life movement was just, a crushing inconsistency with what my parents had done. And so Jane and Betty, Jane was an opera singer who very sadly, quote unquote, gave up opera when she became a Christian because it was a worldly pursuit. But she would play me opera, and she would show me wonderful pictures by Bruegel the Elder and all this other art. And her house became this refuge to which I went literally daily all through childhood as a homeschooled kid in this evangelical mission. Only later did I realize that Jane and Betty were an item. But my childhood exposure was to these two women who had been living together for years as a couple, and sharing with me a principle that I've hung on to for the rest of my life. And I guess the only way I can put it is this: the intrinsic worth of beauty. Because you see, my dad was interested in art and culture, but he was interested only for apologetic reasons. In other words, in discussing the art of Northern Europe and comparing it to Southern Europe and the Reformation countries and comparing it to the Renaissance of the South, or the French Revolution compared to the British Revolution, you weren't interested in these things in and of themselves. It was to illustrate a point that somehow Christianity was better, that if you turned to Jesus, you had a better shot at democracy, or that America had a Christian foundation. It was never for itself. It was like a conversation on an airplane with someone in which the pretense is now we've become friends, but just before they get off the plane, you try to sell them something. You hand them a pamphlet saying, oh, by the way, wouldn't you be interested in signing up for this particular investment package? So the whole apologetic thing. You go to people. Billy Graham used to do it, from the point of view of a sort of a straight up approach. You've got this emptiness and only Jesus can fill it. But my dad would talk about philosophy, theology, and art. The thing with Jane and Betty that was crazy is that, they would show me pictures of a Lorenzetti fresco or a book of hours, or play me Nora, Bellini's Norma and the Casta Diva. It was never about anything but what it was about. And so I don't know how to put this. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was, because in my home, everything was about leading people to Jesus.
Yes.
When you went to Jane and Betty, there was no agenda except Frankie. I want to show you this book. I just bought it in Italy, and these color illustrations of Lorenzetti's frescoes in Siena are the best I've ever seen. Look at this. Or look at this picture by Peter Bruegel the Elder. Those are bottoms sticking out of this little house hanging over a river. Look, you can see that's poop falling into the river.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there just riveted. I mean,
Yeah.
you're talking about a 7 or 8 year old boy.
Yeah.
So my mothering that was given to me, it did take a village. And if it hadn't been for the Jane and Betty of this world, or the Eunice Park, who taught me to read by helping me sing in an operetta because I could learn words singing and not, even if I couldn't read them, and went out of her way. There's this sort of history of people who stood up for me as an adoptive parent at some point. And that's why we can sit here talking, and I haven't killed myself, for instance, while I suffered from depression for many years after bailing from this thing. It's why I'm interested in the intrinsic worth of beauty. It's why I totally buy the idea that some of the best mothering that's done on this planet is by people who don't have kids of their own,
right? Because
that's what happened to me. So, and I'm not making that up as we go along, because what you just said, and I'm sucking up to my host here, that's a whole chapter in my book.
Right.
So we are totally on the same page here. When I talk about have children, that's what I mean.
Right.
I mean, as the human race.
Yes.
Be the person who's walking down the trail, picking that person up. And when it gets to specifics in my book, they're not all big, fancy, highfalutin legislative agendas.
Right.
I talk about leaving a better tip. I'm talking about paying for the grocery cart of the person in the aisle ahead of you who doesn't have the money. It comes down to real stuff. It isn't like, highfalutin principles that we can push off and make into a political program. Yeah, that's some of it. But some of it is just on a much lower key level where we all really live. And I'm urging that with as much ferocity, if I can put it that way, as I am for the big strokes, because I really believe it. Sure. I really think those acts of kindness, I found out many years ago, someone alerted me to the fact, asked me once if I ever left tips in hotel rooms for maids. And as soon as I thought of that, I'd never thought of it. It was always in restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
I always do. And it's not because I suddenly had an epiphany of being kind or more than that. I'm sorry, it's what I would call informed selfishness, because nothing gives you more pleasure because of the way we evolved than actually reaching out and touching people's lives in serendipitous and generous ways. And there are tons of studies on this, that buying your shiny new car, the measurable pleasure in about a week, it's gone. All that shit you think you need and it'll make you happy. And yet people who live these altruistic lives, the better sort of nun who taught all those years and got nothing in return except knowing she was doing the right thing, that you were referencing a while back, they actually lived much happier and longer and better lives.
Yes. Oh, indeed. Absolutely.
And it's measurable.
Yep.
So what I talk about here is almost a selfish altruism. It's sort of an informed altruism, if you want to put it that way. It's not dumb kind of idealism. No. It's much, 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 much closer to the bone than that. We evolved to be caregivers. When we stop doing that, we start getting very lonely and unhappy. And like I say, there's study after study after study in terms of paying forward kindness, that type of thing, that goes to show that, this is a very selfish, but a very beneficially selfish activity.
Well, if I can just put in a plug for a book that I wrote about 5-6 years ago called Journey to the Promised Land, How a Homeless Stranger Took Me Home. And in that book, it's another memoir in which I share my relationship with this homeless guy and how eventually that led to a reconciliation, not a final reconciliation, but a connection, a new connection with my dad, who's just a raving, Bible thumping, fundamentalist Christian with whom I'd been estranged for a lot of years in my life. So you never know when you're going to meet Jesus, when you're going to meet someone who, if you're kind to them and you open your heart to them, they can change your life.
Yeah, and the point I try to make, because, I'm quite secular in my outlook these days, one of the things that I stumbled over in this book that actually my old evangelical friends would be thrilled at, because then they would flip it around and turn it into an apologetic argument,
right? But
it isn't. But it will, if you take out certain things I'm about to say, it could sound that way. The reason the words of Jesus at their best, or any other prophetic voice, resonate with humans, it's total cart and horse. The reason they resonate is they're already there, and they're there because we evolved to care.
Mhm, mhm.
None of that nice stuff Jesus says would ever be in print today, if I can be facetious about it, unless it had corresponded with something that is true innately within the human
Absolutely.
person. And
Yeah.
the reason it's true, and the reason churches were invented, and we have this word called morality, and we have laws, and we have all this other stuff, has nothing to do with enlightenment coming from some sage. It's the other way around. The sages are sage because they managed to encapsulate and put in words that resonated, things that correspond to the most inner depth of who we evolved to be. So who we evolved to be is people who care about others as we care for ourselves. This isn't a fiction. This isn't just only nice born again people who love Jesus do this. It has to do with the fact that we survive because of this behavior. And what we see it replicated is in nature. You know, all these books on trees now that talk about root systems that feed each other and care for a wounded tree. I have a chapter on my dog Zip in the book. You know, you only have to see the fact that Zip, when I come home after being out of the house, will turn away from a dish when he's hungry to come and get some more love first, and jumps up in my lap and licks my face and cuddles, and then goes back and finishes eating. In his list of priorities, making sure I'm welcomed as part of the tribe, and he wants me to know, hey, we're all in this together, right? This is not Jesus altruism. This is nature.
Yeah.
So
This
trees
is
feed
Zip's
each other.
hierarchy of needs.
We co-evolved with dogs, and they were our worst enemy. They were the wolves that we hated and killed.
Mhm.
And then somehow it worked out that we're so closely related now that they share the same kind of cancers we get, and nobody can quite figure out why.
Right.
But they can measure their brains now, and they find that they actually experience the feeling of love, and all the chemical markers are there, and so are the scans. Go figure.
Yeah.
So, you know, you don't have to read the Bible and get your laws from God or whatever to be a good person. You know, this is all in you. And if the words of Jesus resonate, and you're trying to live by the teachings of Jesus, the Beatitudes or whatever it may be, it's because that's who you already are.
Right.
And when it's put into words, it's like, oh, wow, this corresponds with something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's no different than me being, you know, like you, for instance, you slightly remind me of Jane and Betty, not just because you're a lesbian and you've had that life thing, but you look a little bit like. So my warmth towards you is not rational, although we agree on so much. Hey, we're part of being a human is we react to things, you know, the smell of a rose in summer that comes up, you know, the odor that reminds us of being in a kitchen of someone long forgotten, and suddenly it all slams home because that's the smell of her cooking or whatever it may be. That's who we are. So when you resonate with the words of Jesus on something, this doesn't mean that you now have to become a born again Christian and believe he's the Son of God and will come back and burn everybody and send people to hell, or else you'll burn. It just means that there's a basic wisdom there that we respond to.
Absolutely.
And that's the way things really are. So in the case I'm making in the book could be flipped by what I'd call the old-fashioned non-reconstructionist, just loving your heart, you know, Jesus loves you, kind of good old gospel Christian would say, well, the reason it resonates is because, you know, Jesus is the Son of God, and it's all true. And I'd say, okay, fine. As long as you will actually follow those teachings, I'm not going to try to talk you out of it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you're a Trumper and you think that he's your new, you know, leader, I am going to throw the words of Jesus back at you and say, hey, according to what you say you believe, how can you be following this guy? So, you know, that cuts both ways.
Just to remind folks, I'm speaking with Frank Schaeffer, author of Fall in Love, Have Children, Save the Planet, Be Happy. Oh, I forgot Stay Put.
Stay put, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of carbon footprints, by the way,
yeah.
The average American moves 11 times, and it's always oriented towards career and more money.
Yeah, right.
Not every single time, but it's insane. I mean, you know, and then we all whine and complain and bitterly lament the fact that we don't know anybody we live near, or we don't have a community. And it's like, and it's never for the good, it's rarely for good reasons. It's always economic. And it's not always people's fault, because with no childcare provision, with no social safety net, it's a hard scrabble world. So I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying it's a tragedy. Yes. Because, you know, staying put, putting roots down, knowing your neighbors, getting involved. I mean, it's a no brainer.
Yeah.
If you want some stability in your life.
You know, another aspect, Frank, of your book that I love is that you tell us how staying home and caring for grandchildren and the home that made you more of a feminist than you already were, and that, you know, that it made you realize how misogyny hurts men perhaps as much as it hurts women. And I'd like you to talk about this, because our culture just doesn't get that misogyny hurts men as much as it hurts women.
Yeah, and sadly, I have to draw on my own life as an example of this. Being raised, as I put it, by this fundamentalist, in a fundamentalist world of evangelical Reformed theology, which basically told you since you were born, your relationship to all women is that they should be subservient to you. God put men in charge. You're in charge now. That burden carried forward means, and I'm sorry about the language here, but I'm not joking. It means that you are raised to be an asshole by divine right.
Right.
So there, you know, we all have a little quality of assholishness somewhere in us. But if you're being preached to since you were born, hey, you know, that instinct, it's because you're supposed to lead. You know, make sure that your wife obeys you. The example of marriage, you know, your dad screams at your mom and she gives in, and that's the sort of relationship, and he's in charge, you know, the disciplinarian, the leader. If this is drummed into you, of course, what it's doing is basically telling you that your worst instincts that actually are most counterproductive in terms of finding joy and happiness in life are things that you have to not listen to. You've got to rather listen to this biblical narrative of men being in charge. And of course, this is a horrible burden, because if, for instance, in my case, I fell in love with Jeannie when we were teenagers, I got her pregnant when we were teens, and we got married in this evangelical community. And I think I put her through hell, because she came from what I'll call a normal liberal West Coast family. First of all, sort of had to convert to evangelical Christianity to fit in with my clan, because we were in a cult. You have to understand, right? We pulled her into our cult for a while. And then she's got this young husband who's so full of himself and running around as a nepotistic sidekick in the evangelical world. And, you know, when I look back on it, it's with horror. But, you know, the horror is not just what happened back then. It's this feeling that I missed out on so much, because my relationship with her these days is completely different. And we're friends, and sure, we argue still and we have fallings out and so forth, but it's on equal territory. It isn't like one person's in charge by divine right. So it's an honest argument, if you can put it that way. You know, the other day, I don't want to go too Oprah-esque here and sentimental, but I'll share something with you. You know, Jeannie had a mild heart attack about 2 weeks ago, and I spent 3 days in the hospital with her, sitting next to her. She had a stent put in, and she's making a really great recovery. But coming out of that surgical procedure, I asked her, I said, well, you know, were you scared? And she says, yeah, I was nervous. But then I got this crazy feeling of what a wonderful life I've had, and I felt grateful. Now, to an outside observer, they'd say that's really nice, and it's very sentimental, and it's very sweet that she felt that way, and how wonderful. To me, it had a totally different impact. And that was, I know the shit I put her through as this young fundamentalist asshole. And for me, the moving thing about that was the implied forgiveness in that if she looks back over this lifetime that includes having to reform me and to be my mentor, because she has become that on the level of what does it mean to be a human being, period. And she hung in there with me. You know, to me, it struck my ear totally different than you would have heard it if you were standing there, because you weren't this asshole by divine right. And she stuck with me because we were in love and we were young, and not every aspect of my character was terrible. But I look at this as a kind of an affirmation of her confidence in me. The difference that we have in our relationship now that I really am someone who believes in an egalitarian principle of human relationships, and I live by that. You know, we don't have to have any discussions of shared housework in this house. I do my bit, not because Jeannie tells me to or whatever, but, you know, this is my best friend. This is my partner. This isn't the woman I'm living with in a relationship defined by some biblical narrative that I no longer believe in. This is someone whose my happiness depends on, in the sense that, and again, I don't want to wax maudlin here, and I'm pushing 70, so I can get a little bit sentimental. The part of the relationship I enjoy most is when she's happy. That may seem like a no-brainer, but that's so different than the role model that I was given by my father, where everybody has to be controlled. Yeah. And it to someone who didn't grow up in my background and didn't have that vision of toxic malehood pushed on them, if that's a term, I don't know, you just don't get it. But the burden that rolled off my back when I didn't have to carry that leadership, hero in your own mind shit around, and could be honest and tell Jeannie, hey, I am really depressed. I'm having suicidal thoughts. I look back with horror at how disciplinarian I was with our children when they were young, and the difference, say, with my grandchildren. This is a life that's been lived in evangelical terms of repentance, but not in the way they mean it, because it's led to real change. And so when I write in theory in my book about how feminism is an evolutionary step, and it's the only hope we have of saving the human race, literally, it's like opposable thumbs or standing up and walking upright. It's a step. It has nothing to do with social consciousness raising or political endeavor. It can't be stopped any more than a tsunami can. It is the future. And the future is a recalibration of human relationships based on the female, I think, taking the lead now in human development. Mm-hmm. And in the book, my journey out of the bondage of this toxic idea of what a male is supposed to be doing, as according to what the quote unquote Bible teaches, is basically the foundation of the book. Now, it's not what the whole book is about, but when I get to it, all I can tell you is this is not business. This is personal. This is nothing to do with a theory with me. I've lived it. I have been on the wrong side of history. And who suffered most? It wasn't Jeannie, because she always knew who she was. It was me, because I'd been given this insane vision of what a man is. And thank God, for her kindness and her forbearance. And also, she's tough as shit, man. I mean, Jeannie is a she can kick ass, and it's not like she was this pushover and always being kind and touchy-feely. She's a tough therapist, but she's stuck in there and voted with her feet and didn't abandon me. So, I owe everything to her, literally. I owe everything to her. And the big thing I owe to her is, she never put it this way, but is to get over myself as a male. And I found so much freedom in that. It's so relaxing to be able to talk to you, say today, Carolyn, and I'm doing a lot of talking because we're talking about my book. But that if we were just having coffee, I wouldn't be dominating the conversation because I'm a male. No. I'm just talking because this is, you're interviewing me. Right. But believe me, you visit me in the house sometime, and I'll keep my mouth shut, and it'll be you and Jeannie talking. And if I say something in the middle of the meal, fine. But I'll have no sense that I ought to be leading the conversation. All this crap that I was born with, where my dad sat at the head of the table and held forth for hours. And it was all, the headship of the home. And then he preached for an hour and a half on Sunday sermon. My mother relegated to drawing pictures for her children to try to keep us interested. There was this tiered system, and women were pretty low on the totem pole. Yeah.
Well, Frank, I have one more question for you. And it's the juiciest of all to me. One of the aspects of your book that was really like a breath of fresh air, like finding an oasis in a scorching desert, was your emphasis on joy. Mm-hmm. And as you know, Andrew Harvey and I wrote a book in 2016 called Return to Joy. Yes. And you emphasize in your book the sheer joy that comes from caring and caregiving. To some extent, our careers bring us joy. To some extent, making money brings us joy. But nothing brings joy like caring, community, and looking after each other. Yes. Please say more about this.
Well, you have just stated the end point of the book in a way, because to me, again, this is not business. This is personal. Yeah. I'm my book is sort of backward in the sense that I stumbled into these things. And that's sort of the pattern of my life. I stumbled into a loving relationship with my little San Francisco hippie princess, who's become this converted Christian because she came to L'Abri from a nominally Roman Catholic liberal West Coast background. And then she leads me out. And the caregiving's the same. You stumble into it and you discover that it's not a question of principle, but, damn it, I really am enjoying this. What's going on here? This is not how I used to describe myself to myself. So I found myself doing things and very, very joyful in them, and then started casting about for reasons, as in how can this be? So to me, the discovery of caregiving then opened a whole door, a whole window on just a whole way of being. And of course, this is what the environmental movement is, caregiving for the planet. And the joy people like that, like my friend Moby, the singer that I interviewed on my podcast in conversation with Frank Schaeffer, Moby and I spent a whole bunch of time talking about the fact of his vegetarianism, his veganism, his activity on the behalf of animals. I'm not sitting there saying, oh, too bad he doesn't have a child. I'm sitting there saying, thank God somebody's posting online these gorgeous pictures of what nature should be, and reminding me every single day that, the squirrel running around digging something up I've just planted is not a nuisance. He got here first. And, make room for this little guy and take pleasure in the beauty of the sunlight shining through his little translucent ears as the sunset catches them. And it's a different vision, and it comes from people like Moby. So to me, caregiving is not just about kids. It's about a whole other thing. I had a friend who back in the 80s, before there was a cure for AIDS, spent 7 years of his life caring for his gay lover in New York City. And was one of the big wake-up calls I had, because I was still at a phase of my life when I would be looking at him saying, isn't this the enemy? But then this enemy is doing everything I say I believe in, but he's actually doing it. He's moved from a big apartment into a one-room walk-up, in Greenwich Village, so that he can care for this person. They don't have anything to live on. They're going broke. Who are these people? So the funny thing is, in terms of a witness of life that you find attractive, it's always the people who are reaching out. There's something instinctual in us that tells us that, becoming a billionaire and building your own rocket ship is not a noble endeavor. Right. But my friend who moved so he could care for his lover, dying of a very unattractive disease, a very threatening, horrible death sentence at that period before the medication kicked in, and they changed and they finally did some research. There have been markers in my life of caregiving. My sister Debbie, who took care of my mother for the last 10 years of her life, sure, I visited, but my mom was living with her in Switzerland, and Debbie brought over her furniture and rearranged things, not in her room, but gave her a wonderful life to live, put a piano in there so she could listen to people playing music, because it was such a pleasure of her life. When I see the people who've done noble things around me that you want to imitate, that you say, yeah, if two lines are forming, I'd rather be in the shadow of that person. It isn't ever the big, heavy duty, triumphant anything. It's always the caregiver. And I emphasize again, this has nothing to do with biological parenthood. And so for me, I just think that if we want to find joy, to use your term, which is a better one than be happy, going back to your book, it's a fool's errand to find it on another path. Now, if the success in terms of what the economic structure around us calls success happens to someone, I've known some wealthy people who have done some good things for people and been caregivers. They're far and few between, but they're a hell of a lot happier than, these greedy people who just want more. And at the end of the day, they seem to live a much more fulfilled life, and their relationships are better too, and they have better families and better relationships and better connection with their community. So caregiving, if there's a litmus test out there, the litmus test is the caregiving test. It isn't the acquisition and the money test. And of course, that's what the book is about. But I don't think this is a sort of a misplaced altruism. I think it's actually the road to finding joy in one's life.
Yeah. Well, I want to say to everyone, please, please buy this book. You need to read this book. You absolutely need to buy and have and read, fall in love, have children, stay put, save the planet, be happy. And Frank, I want you to tell everyone the name of your website and your email address, because I know you
Sure.
don't have problems with giving out your email address.
Absolutely.
So website?
Website is just frankschaeffer.com. But the way to get in touch with me, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and there's a podcast I do that I interviewed Carolyn on. And that podcast is available. And that's just In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. But if you read the book and you'd like to talk to me and have a question, or you'd like me to be part of a book club, or which, by the way, can be you and your mother-in-law, that's fine. I'm not talking big fancy things here. It's just my name with the middle initial A, Frank A. Schaeffer, FrankASchaeffer at good old fashioned AOL.com. Frank A. Schaeffer at AOL. I have a Gmail account for my, regular stuff, but the AOL account is the one I've had for years and my family uses, so I will get it there.
It has been my extreme pleasure, Frank, to talk with you today. This has been such a juicy conversation, and I just love listening to you. For years and years, I've watched you on TV in various interviews and wanted to really sit down and talk with you. And recently I had the wonderful pleasure of being interviewed by you, Conversations with Frank Schaeffer. It's on Facebook. And now today, I get to interview you about this wonderful book. So thank you so much. I wish you well with this incredible book. I love you. I consider you a spiritual sibling. And thank you for your time today, and be well and be safe.
Thank you, Carolyn, for your caregiving today. And I mean that sincerely. Thank you for reaching out.
You betcha.